I am Elian Cross, and I am 35 years old. For a long time, I believed loyalty was something that didn't need negotiation. I believed that if you showed up consistently, quietly, without drama, the people closest to you would do the same when it mattered. I believed family was a fixed structure, unmoving, reliable, immune to convenience. I was wrong. What follows is not a story about revenge or dramatic confrontation. It's a story about discipline, restraint, and what happens when you stop asking to be understood and start building a life that speaks for itself. Before we go any further, please like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like this reach people who may be living them quietly, without words, without witnesses. When I lost everything, it didn't happen loudly. There was no single moment people could point to and say, "That's when it fell apart." It happened the way erosion happens, slowly, almost politely. A job dissolved under the language of restructuring. Savings thinned under the weight of time. Confidence didn't shatter, it dimmed. And the one person who noticed, truly noticed, wasn't a manager or a friend. It was my older brother, Dorian Hale. At the time, I was living in a modest apartment in Northbridge, a clean, modern district known for its quiet efficiency. Glass-fronted buildings, well-kept sidewalks, the kind of place where people smiled without curiosity. I worked a mid-level strategy role at a consulting firm, nothing glamorous but stable. I believed stability was enough. I believed if I played my role well, life would remain reasonable. That belief cracked one evening at a polished cafe near Dorian's office. The kind of place where the lighting was warm and the tables were spaced just far enough apart to discourage intimacy. He sat across from me, phone face down but never far from his hand. His jacket was perfectly pressed. His expression was careful. "You can stay for a few weeks," he said, stirring his coffee though it had already gone cold. "But you need to understand my situation." I nodded, even as my chest tightened. "I'm not asking for much," I said. "Just time. I'll figure it out." Dorian smiled in a way that felt rehearsed. "You always say that." What he didn't say was clearer than anything he did. My inconvenience had become visible. My unemployment disrupted the image he had built so carefully. I was no longer a neutral presence in his life. I was a variable. The weeks that followed were measured and quiet. The guest room was clean, impersonal. My suitcase stayed zipped in the corner like a reminder that I wasn't meant to settle. At first, nothing was said. Then small comments crept in. "You're still interviewing? Any updates? How long do these processes usually take?" Each question sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed pressure. Rules appeared without announcement. When I could use the kitchen. How late I could stay up. Which conversations felt welcome and which didn't. One evening, Dorian stood in the doorway of the guest room, arms folded loosely, voice calm. "Elian, this isn't sustainable." That was the word he chose. Sustainable. As if I were a line item. As if my presence needed justification beyond blood. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I packed my things the next morning with quiet precision. One suitcase. One backpack. When I left, he hugged me briefly and said, "This is for the best." I believed him. Or maybe I needed to. What Dorian never noticed was the shift that happened the moment I stepped outside. The moment I stopped explaining myself to someone committed to misunderstanding me. That was the night I stopped hoping for rescue and started preparing for distance. Rock bottom, I learned, is not dramatic. There were no crowds watching me fail. No confrontation scenes. Just mornings that arrived without urgency and nights that stretched longer than they should. I rented a small room in a shared apartment owned by Marin Solis, a remote product designer who spoke softly and asked no questions. The space was clean, neutral, intentionally forgettable. It felt temporary in a way I appreciated. I didn't need walls that remembered who I used to be. Every morning, I dressed as if I still had somewhere important to go. Structured trousers. Neutral shirts. Hair pulled back neatly. I sent applications with precision, tailored resumes, thoughtful cover letters. The silence that followed was relentless. Weeks passed. Savings thinned. Pride learned how to sit quietly in the corner. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. "Dorian, just checking in. Hope you're doing okay." The message felt professional. Distant. I stared at it longer than necessary, then placed the phone face down. I didn't trust myself to respond without reopening something I had already closed. Instead, I opened my laptop and revisited an idea I had abandoned years earlier. It was a market intelligence tool I'd once pitched internally, flagged as interesting but not scalable. At the time, I believed them. I was younger then, more cautious, more concerned with approval. Now, with nothing left to protect, I allowed myself to believe something else. Late nights returned, but this time they were deliberate. Focused. I sketched workflows, mapped user pain points, refined value propositions. For the first time in months, my mind felt sharp again. Marin noticed. "You work like someone building an exit," she said one night, leaning against the doorframe. I smiled faintly. "Not an exit," I replied. "A return." What I didn't say was that I had stopped waiting for my brother to understand me. I was building something quieter now. Something that didn't need permission. 3 months passed. My routine hardened into discipline. I woke before sunrise. Worked until my eyes burned. Progress came in small, private victories. A functioning prototype, a thoughtful email, a scheduled call that didn't end in polite rejection. It wasn't success yet, but it was momentum. My first investor meeting happened over video. Rowan Pierce, calm, observant, listened more than she spoke. When I finished, silence lingered. "You're calm," she finally said. "Most people sell confidence. You're selling clarity." "I don't have time for theater," I replied. She smiled. "Good. Neither do I." The check wasn't large, but it was real. I sat alone afterward, staring at the confirmation email, hands trembling. Not from fear, but relief I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that moment. I didn't tell Dorian. As the company began to take shape, so did I. I moved into a slightly larger apartment, still modest, unmistakably mine. I hired 2 contractors. Learned to lead without apology. Occasionally, I checked Dorian's social media. The same polished life. Promotions announced with gratitude. Smiling photos framed as growth. I closed the app each time with the same thought. He has no idea. The first public recognition came quietly. A niche industry newsletter mentioned the platform in a ones to watch column. No photos. No fanfare. Just a paragraph about efficiency and execution. A week later, my phone rang. "Elian." Dorian's voice sounded surprised, like he'd forgotten how my name felt in his mouth. "Yes. I saw something online," he said carefully. "About a company. Is that you?" "It is." Silence. "That's wow. I didn't know you were working on anything like that." "Neither did you," I replied gently. "I'm proud of you," he said. The words landed late, but I thanked him anyway. When the call ended, I felt lighter, not because of his approval, but because I no longer needed it. That was when I understood something fundamental. The betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had clarified me, and I was only just beginning. The months that followed unfolded without ceremony. There were no dramatic turning points, no single day where everything suddenly made sense. Growth came incrementally, the way trust does when it's earned rather than promised. The company expanded quietly, contracts stacking one by one, each agreement less exciting than the last but infinitely more meaningful. I learned to value consistency over spectacle. Consistency was what kept the lights on. Consistency was what built leverage. My days became structured with intention. Morning reviews. Midday calls. Evenings reserved for thinking, not reacting. I stopped measuring progress by external affirmation and started tracking it through alignment. Did this decision serve the long-term system I was building? Did it preserve clarity? Did it cost me sleep? If the answer was yes, I adjusted. With growth came visibility, and with visibility came a different kind of pressure. Meetings moved from video calls to glass-walled boardrooms with city views designed to intimidate rather than inspire. I walked into those spaces with quiet authority, not because I felt powerful, but because I felt prepared. Preparation, I learned, was the most reliable form of confidence. One evening, during a late dinner with Rowan, she glanced at me over the rim of her glass and said, "You know they're watching you now." I smiled faintly. They always were. I just didn't notice. What I didn't say was that visibility had reached places I never intended it to, including people who once believed I would fade quietly. Including my brother. The invitation arrived in an envelope thicker than necessary, embossed lettering announcing a corporate gala celebrating innovation and leadership. I recognized the host company immediately. It was one Dorian had once spoken about with thinly veiled envy, a place he'd applied to more than once and been rejected without explanation. I read the details slowly. Venue, date, dress code. My name appeared not under guest, but featured speaker. Marin whistled when she saw it. "That's not subtle," she said. "No," I replied. "It's precise. Are you going?" I considered the question longer than I expected. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood what the room would represent. Yes, I said finally. I think I am. The night of the event, the city shimmered under controlled light. I arrived in a tailored black dress, understated, intentional. It didn't beg for attention, but it didn't hide either. As I stepped into the venue, conversations softened. Heads turned, not dramatically, but enough. I spotted Dorian almost immediately. He stood near the bar, suit impeccable, posture confident. When his eyes met mine, recognition flickered, then disbelief. "Elian," he said, approaching slowly. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I'm speaking tonight," I replied. The silence between us stretched. "Of course you are," he said, laughing too quickly. What he didn't say, but couldn't hide, was the realization settling behind his eyes. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was the life he had once imagined for himself, standing comfortably inside my reality. When I took the stage, the spotlight felt natural, like something I had already rehearsed internally 100 times. I didn't look nervous. I didn't look triumphant either. I looked composed, grounded. I spoke about systems, about foresight, about resilience without ever using the word struggle. I didn't dramatize my journey. I didn't need to. The room listened anyway. "This platform wasn't built in ideal conditions," I said calmly. "It was built in clarity." Applause followed me off stage, sustained and sincere. Later, Dorian found me near the balcony overlooking the city. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how serious you were back then." "You didn't ask," I replied. The words landed harder than I intended. He nodded, swallowing. I should have done more. I didn't argue. I didn't reassure him. That season of my life was over. The days after the gala brought attention I hadn't anticipated. Emails flooded in. Invitations followed. Partnerships proposed. I filtered everything with the same discipline that had built the company in the first place. Growth, I learned, could be just as dangerous as failure if left unchecked. Dorian reached out more frequently after that. Lunch suggestions. Casual check-ins. Mentions of catching up properly. I declined politely, consistently. One evening he asked, "Did I really hurt you that much?" I paused before answering. "You didn't hurt me," I said honestly. "You clarified things." Silence followed. "I never meant to push you away," he said. "I know," I replied. "But intent doesn't change impact." After the call ended, I sat with the weight of the moment, not heavy, just real. I hadn't planned this transformation as revenge. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right. Months passed. The company scaled. Contracts grew larger. Meetings shifted into rooms where decisions didn't ask permission to be disruptive. I listened more than I spoke, mapping personalities, noting who traded in ego and who traded in foresight. When I finally contributed, it was with precision. One executive leaned back afterward and said, "You don't sound like someone who is lucky." "I wasn't," I replied. Respect followed. Not loudly. Steadily. Dorian's attempts to reconnect grew more personal. Coffee. Dinner. Then an invitation to visit his place, as if returning to the scene of the fracture might heal it. "I'm busy," I said gently. "With what?" he asked, frustration slipping through. "With my life," I replied. The silence on the line told me everything. He wasn't angry. He was unsettled. I hired carefully, choosing competence over familiarity. My team reflected my values: clear thinkers, calm under pressure, uninterested in drama. During a strategy session, a junior analyst asked, "How did you know this would work?" "I didn't," I said. "I just knew I wouldn't abandon it." The room went quiet, not awkwardly but thoughtfully. A feature article followed. This time there were photos. Neutral-toned office. Relaxed posture. Unreadable expression. The headline framed my story as resilience. Privately, I refined the truth. It wasn't resilience alone. It was restraint. The first acquisition offer arrived unexpectedly. Large numbers. Aggressive timelines. Language designed to rush me into agreement. I declined without hesitation. "You didn't even negotiate," Rowan said. "They want control," I replied. "I want longevity." That night, I slept deeply. I ran into Dorian again at an engagement party hosted by a mutual acquaintance. He looked tired. Less polished. "You seem different," he said. "I am. Do you ever think about how things could have gone?" he asked. "They went exactly how they needed to," I replied. For the first time, he had no response. Driving home that night, I realized something quietly profound. Closure wasn't something people gave you. It was something you decided to stop chasing. And I had stopped. The shift between my brother and me became permanent not because of a confrontation, but because of silence that no longer needed filling. Weeks passed without messages. Then months. I noticed the absence only once, when I realized I felt no urge to explain myself anymore. That was new. For most of my life, I had carried a quiet need to be understood, especially by family. Now, understanding felt optional. My days were full, structured around purpose rather than reaction. Meetings began on time. Decisions landed cleanly. My life moved forward without dragging the past behind it. One evening, while preparing notes for a keynote address, I paused at my desk and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. I thought about the version of myself who had begged for patience, who had swallowed humiliation to keep peace, who had mistaken proximity for loyalty. That person felt familiar but distant, not erased, integrated. I hadn't erased the pain. I had used it as a compass. The keynote was held in Riverton Hall, a modern auditorium known for hosting leaders who preferred substance over spectacle. The audience was attentive, restrained. The kind that listened more than applauded. I spoke plainly. About systems. About foresight. About building in obscurity. I didn't mention family. I didn't mention betrayal. I didn't need to. Afterward, applause followed, not thunderous but sincere. A young woman approached me as the crowd thinned. Her posture was careful, like she didn't want to take up too much space. "I needed to see someone like you," she said. "Someone who didn't explain herself." I smiled softly. "You don't owe anyone a performance," I replied. "Just your best work." She nodded, eyes bright, and walked away. That moment stayed with me longer than the applause. Months later, I stood in my new office, a space defined by clean lines, natural light, and intentional calm. It wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. It reflected my values: clarity, focus, autonomy. As I reviewed quarterly reports, Nolan Vire, my operations lead, knocked lightly on the open door. "You've been invited to join the advisory board," he said, handing over a folder. I scanned the header and felt a small, incredulous smile form. This wasn't just recognition. It was influence. That evening, I ran into Dorian unexpectedly at a quiet restaurant near my office. He looked different. Less polished. More tired. "Looks like you've built something real," he said. "I have." He hesitated. "I used to imagine this life," he admitted softly. "I thought it would come easier." I regarded him thoughtfully. Most things worth having don't. We parted without resolution. Without reconciliation. Just truth exchanged plainly. As I walked back into the night, city lights reflecting in the glass around me, I felt no urge to look back. My life no longer needed witnesses. It spoke for itself. Success changed how people spoke to me, but not how I listened. I remained attentive, deliberate, resistant to noise. Every decision passed through the same filter. Does this serve the life I'm building? One afternoon, Rowan asked me, "Do you ever think about how it all started?" I did, but only to remember what not to repeat. I had learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it comes disguised as practicality, as reason, as concern. I had learned to trust patterns over promises. And I had learned that the most powerful response isn't confrontation. It's alignment. When I finally looked back, not at my brother, not at the past, but at the woman I had become, I felt something close to peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on approval. The solid kind that comes from self-trust. My schedule tightened as the company entered its next phase. Expansion brought pressure, and pressure revealed character, in people and systems alike. I noticed who leaned in when decisions became uncomfortable and who leaned away when certainty disappeared. Late one evening, after a long board call, I sat alone in my office. City lights blinked beyond the glass like quiet affirmations. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge something I had avoided naming. I was no longer surviving. I was shaping outcomes. My phone buzzed. A message from Dorian. I saw the announcement. Advisory board. That's huge. I didn't respond immediately. Not out of bitterness. Out of discernment. I had learned the difference. The advisory board meetings introduced me to a different tier of conversation. These were rooms where decisions didn't ask permission to disrupt. I listened more than I spoke at first, mapping motives, noting who traded in ego and who traded in foresight. When I finally contributed, it was with precision. One man leaned back afterward and said, "You don't sound like someone who is lucky." I'm not, I replied. Respect followed, not loudly but steadily. Dorian's attempts to reconnect grew more personal. Coffee, dinner, then a request to visit his place, as if returning to the site of the fracture might undo it. I'm busy, I said gently. With what? He asked. With my life. The silence that followed told me everything. I hired carefully, choosing competence over familiarity. My team reflected my values. During a strategy session, a junior analyst asked, "How did you know this would work?" I didn't, I said. I just knew I wouldn't abandon it. Commitment, I learned, was contagious. A feature article followed. This time with photos. Neutral tones. Quiet confidence. The headline framed my story as resilience. Privately, I refined the truth. It wasn't resilience alone. It was restraint. The first acquisition offer arrived soon after. Large numbers. Aggressive timelines. Language designed to rush consent. I declined without negotiation. They want control, I said. I want longevity. That night, I slept deeply. I ran into Dorian again at a mutual acquaintance's celebration. He watched me closely. You're not trying to prove anything anymore, he said. I never was, I replied. I was trying to build something I wouldn't have to explain. Driving home that night, I reflected on the symmetry of it all. The betrayal that once hollowed me out now felt like a distant echo. I no longer replayed conversations. I no longer imagined alternative endings. Closure, I realized, isn't something people give you. It's something you decide to stop chasing. Months later, the company crossed a milestone I had once scribbled into a notebook during my lowest week. I thanked my team briefly and returned to work. Celebration, I believed, was best expressed through continuity. That night alone, I opened that old notebook. The handwriting was shakier. The margins crowded with doubt. I closed it gently, not ashamed but grateful. My brother's betrayal had not been the climax of my story. It had been the inciting incident. The real story was what followed. The choices made without witnesses. The discipline practiced in obscurity. The refusal to become smaller to keep others comfortable. I wasn't living the life Dorian once imagined for himself. I was living the life I had designed. And the distance between those two things was everything. The final message from him arrived weeks later. I see it now. I hope you're happy. I read it once, then placed the phone face down and returned to my work. Not because I was cold, but because I was finished. Finished shrinking. Finished waiting. Finished carrying guilt that was never mine. I never confronted my brother. I never demanded apology or recognition. I chose something far more decisive. I moved forward without him. And in doing so, I arrived with a life so complete it required no explanation. And if this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tap the bell so you never miss a new folktale, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that quiet discipline often builds the loudest legacy.